So time to take another look at what's in the Sunday papers. This morning I'm joined by the entrepreneur Kate Hardcastle and the broadcaster and journalist Thomas Copeland. Welcome back to both of you. We dealt with a lot of the front pages in the last hour, so let's turn our attention to some of the inside stories. I say inside stories, we're starting with the front page. There we go, I've contradicted myself already, but we will go inside in a moment. Thomas, let's deal with the Sunday People though. There's an article that took your attention. The headline there is Plain Stupid Tories. Why so?
Well, this is a story that the Sunday People have picked up through Freedom of Information requests. The think tank, the Taxpayer Alliance, has figured out that 800 grand has been spent painting the UK's red, white and blue branding on the plane that the Prime Minister flies. And so that they're running with this story. It's the second sort of plane that this has happened to. This was a bit of a controversy under Boris Johnson, and people remember this being a big story during the pandemic. Since about 2020, about 1.7 million has been spent on total in repainting planes, and so it's a great front page story. I'm always a bit unsure of stories like this. You know, on one hand, we've got to crack down on government waste, and we should be scrupulous, and we should scrutinise money like this being spent. I suppose on the other hand, in the overall national scheme of things, 800 grand isn't a lot of money. It would fund the NHS for sort of 3 or 4 hours. And it doesn't seem totally, unreasonable that a country like the United Kingdom should have a plane for a Prime Minister, representatives in the case of the UK, members of the royal family. And even the article itself says that the Prime Minister uses this plane very frequently.
Sorry to interrupt, Thomas.
Lithuania next week. Yeah.
It's not just about having the plane, though, I guess. It's whether or not it needs to be painted a different colour. Is that the issue?
Well, of course, and this money is specifically about the money being painted. Before this, of course, the UK government did fly, as did members of the royal family, on just military jets from the RAF. And it was an outlier in terms of major economies around the world in that sense. So it could go back to that. But the point I'm making, I suppose, is that it's a more nuanced case. 800 grand sounds like a lot if you look at your household budget. In the case of the national economy, it's a very small amount of money, but it could be used and better spent perhaps elsewhere. People might prefer that we fund another 3-4 hours of NHS care for that money. And you know what? If you don't have some paint on your plane, what's the big deal?
Well, yes, and I noticed that the government talks about how ministers and members of the royal household sometimes require the use of non-commercial air travel, and they say the aircraft with its Global Britain livery promotes a strong image of the role the UK plays on the international stage when it's used by government members. So let's move on, shall we, Kate, to the Observer, and they have an article about AI. There's a lot about AI at the moment, isn't there? And there are a lot of fears about it, but also others saying it could be hugely beneficial. So what take does the Observer give us this morning?
Well, artificial intelligence is something that I've been involved with and worked for many years, and I agree with you. There's an education piece that needs to be done. Every time we seem to see a story, it has this type of imagery that we can see here, doesn't it? You know, almost like the action figures and everything's very robotic. But it's been around us for so very long, and it's the involvement of it that we need to understand a lot more. The story talks about the fact that there's plans to set up an institute in Cambridge, and that will be run by the former diplomat Stephen Cave. And it talks about how it's so important to understand and educate. It talks about the speculation that we've seen in press and media, particularly about things like loss of jobs and talking about data protection. And the more that we understand it, the more that we can actually ensure that users are safe, people who are interacting with organisations who use it are safe, and that people perhaps aren't as fearful and understand the benefits. And recently I had the opportunity to hear from NVIDIA, who are this organisation right at the heart of it, and they had a job to try and persuade us as creatives not to be fearful of this. They showed us how it's been part of pretty much every film that we've been watching. You know, that AI created those spaceships. The AI created a lot of the imagery that we've seen, and how it can be used for good if the right regulations are put in. So I guess the story is, don't be as fearful of this. We need many more women in the industry, but we need to make sure that we understand the benefits, which could be in the medical profession, could be in the environmental opportunity, as much as we think about it as this quite robotic and alien entity.
Well, yes, and as you say, I'm sure there are lots of areas that could benefit, but you mentioned the issue of regulation. I guess, Kate, the issue is whether regulation can keep up with technological development. That's one of the worries, isn't it?
Always going to be the case, and we've got to get balance in there. But we see day after day how quickly technology moves, and I think it's the users that need to make sure that they've got the usability, the guide to how they use it and where they can expect their data to be.
Yeah. Okay, Thomas, take us to the front of the Sunday Telegraph now, because there's a story here about foreign students and their places at British universities.
That's right. This story is really interesting because of its framing. You can see that the headline there is foreign students may take places from British applicants, and they lead by saying that middle-class British students may be missing out at university places. What's really going on here is there's a policy in the UK where the fees for British students to attend British universities is capped at just over £9,000. And it's been capped that way since about 2017. Now, that seems like a really sensible policy because, of course, it means that no student has to pay more than that. They're not saddled with any more debt than that. The problem is that that number has stayed that way since 2017. And, of course, a lot's changed since 2017. Sort of rampant inflation, soaring costs in loads of different ways, and university costs have gone up. The catch is that universities can charge international students way, way more than £9,000. And so in order to kind of balance the books, what's happening is that universities are trying to attract more international students and take in more international students. And there's a statistic here from an ex-director, admissions director of UCAS, saying that they're expecting this autumn the number of international students to rise by another 30% in the UK. And that figure's been going up for an extensive period of time now. And what that means is that the total number of undergraduate students in a university likely in nearly all cases isn't rising commensurably with that. So what happens is that somebody has to be displaced. In this case, it would be British students in general. And then this article is tagging on to that a sort of less statistical thing, which is that universities in general are trying to attract students from further down the socioeconomic ladder, and the government's trying to do the same. And then all of that is under the context of a government at the moment that's kind of keen to try to stop immigration in lots of different forms, and that includes university students coming into the country. The bottom line is that universities can't afford to keep taking students if the cap's going to remain at that £9,000. They're forced to look at international students. So it probably kind of comes down to looking at whether it's time to change whether students should be charged more, and the financing for their debt needs to change. Does the government need to start paying more for students to come in? That's ultimately what this story is all about.
Yeah, and that's going to be an ongoing debate, isn't it? As students are sort of dealing with their debt in a cost of living crisis as well. There are so many issues involved, aren't there? Let's, Kate, turn to the Observer now, and anyone planning their holiday, probably quite excited, but probably a little bit worried that strikes may impact it. So what's this article tell us?
It's certainly a case of a warning here that you are not going to get compensation if your flight is affected by strike action. And it's strike action from air traffic control. We know, obviously, there is also strike action when it comes to the railways and the underground too. But this particularly focuses on your travel insurance and where you stand and what your rights are. Of course, the airlines have a duty of care to get you on your way, to look after you if your flight's impacted by strike action to a great extent in terms of time. But if you felt that you might then be able to claim for that in some way for compensation, you're not going to get that. And there's a reminder in the article that travel insurance, it's really worth checking out where you stand, what you might have within your policy, but also not to jump out now and try and buy a policy to cover you for this strike action, because insurance policies are there about to protect you about the unknown. And this is now announced. Although we don't know the dates of the air traffic control strike action, it's going to be at a point where we know it's going to cause maximum impact, and that's probably likely to be that first week of the school holidays.
Yeah, so a bit of a headache for people, that, isn't it? Let's wait and see when those dates are. And Thomas, a lot of talk about President Biden's sending cluster munitions, these controversial bombs to Ukraine, and the impact that could have on the NATO meeting coming up. Covered in the Mail on Sunday.
Right. This story's gained a good bit of traction where I am at the moment in the US over a controversial decision. Joe Biden says he had to be talked into giving these munitions to Ukraine really quickly. They're condemned in a lot of ways because they have a higher impact on civilians. They basically give out lots of small explosives, and some of them don't explode, are left and then found by civilians. This story is creating, I think, a little bit of a US-UK split. Rishi Sunak's got a very carefully worded statement in which he states a fact, which is that the UK is a signatory to a convention which discourages the use of cluster bombs. The US is not, Ukraine is not, Russia is not. And then in the rest of the statement, Rishi Sunak goes on with some fairly boilerplate stuff about supporting Ukraine. Okay. The reality is the UK and US are so tight militarily. The split is one of semantics, really.
Okay.
Bigger questions about what the actual impact of these munitions are.
And sadly, Kate, we haven't got time to deal with your grief rave in a pink disco kiosk. I know, so annoying, and you've got the jacket to match it as well, so people will have to read that for themselves. I think it's in The Observer. But really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks both.